This module discusses how adults might have respectful and honest conversations on race. When we avoid these conversations, it's too easy to develop and to hold on to distrust for those whose opinions we believe are different from our own. Having open and honest conversations allow us to better understand one another, even if we disagree. Because such conversations can be uncomfortable, we're going to talk about some general guidelines to help everyone feel safe and heard. As I'm sure we're all well aware, recent events have shown that race is a topic on which honest conversations are long overdue. Communities around the world have taken to social media and to the streets to protest the range of inequities and injustices that have been institutionalized based on race. While the conversations are challenging and uncomfortable, the current focus presents a valuable window of opportunity for meaningful discussion and transformation. We, as educators, must take advantage of this opportunity to come together to talk about the need for meaningful changes in society. Part of an honest discussion starts with an acknowledgement of the fact that the United States has a deep history of racism and oppression. And while some progress has been made, explicit and implicit racism still exists. To say that things are better than they once were is a hollow claim. As long as there is injustice and inequity for any citizen, it is our responsibility to speak out and demand change for humanity. Perhaps Angela Davis said it best. In a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. Ibram X. Kendi states, the opposite of racist isn't not racist, it is anti-racist. What is the difference? One endorses either the idea of racial hierarchy as racist or racial equity as anti-racist. One allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. Deconstructing implicit biases, preconceived notions about race, and working to educate ourselves on relevant matters are steps that we can take towards being active advocates against racial injustice. Individuals around the world are ready to engage in conversation, in protest, in advocacy, in revolution. When it comes to tackling the issue of racial equity, we need to be cognizant and informed of these fundamental issues related to it. Creating purposeful dialogue on race helps us to be better equipped in fighting racial injustices. Systematic change is necessary in creating the equality that marginalized communities deserve, and educated conversations can be the first steps to making that change. To get started, let's hear from some JCPS educators.
For a lot of these white folks who are in charge of educating these kids were like truly ignorant to it. It doesn't excuse it, but that's not the point. The point is, this is a moment of opportunity where the conversation is being had, and if we are able to seize this opportunity and use it as a jumping off point to have conversations, then it's a possibility that we could help them recognize their blind spots and maybe get some people out of education, but maybe just help educate some people and help them become better, more socially responsive teachers.
Having tough conversations with staff becomes really uncomfortable because it is those like implicit biases that people aren't aware of. And then you see the social media posts from teachers who are just being overt because they've been in this uncomfortable conversation or situation. And so I think there's even more turmoil around racial issues within the teacher profession right now.
If you only cover like 20% of the content, but the kids really know you listen and you value them as individuals, then they're going to learn that 20%. You can cover 100% of the content, but if they don't think you value them as people, they're not going to learn any of it, period. So you might like that. You're using your time a lot more wisely to stop teaching the content sometimes. And teachers get weird about that.
Yeah.
I gotta get through it. Wow. What's the consequence if you don't? What does it matter? But the other thing is, and like to touch on leadership and teachers themselves, I think you said 83% of our teachers in the district are white.
Yeah.
Like it's really important as part of that process that white teachers like sort of acknowledge their whiteness and like get in touch with that whiteness and realize it's a thing. Because I think a lot of our teachers, like, the term colorblind or whatever, well, they don't realize that these students are coming into their class with this trauma, with these different experiences, and they're coming at it from like this objective place, and they're like, oh, well, I'm just telling them, and they don't understand the perspectives are different. So like, as part of this training, if we're going to emphasize it, I mean, the implicit bias is a part of it, obviously, but we need to have our white teachers be aware of their whiteness. Like, if we could just get that, like, if we can cross that threshold, then, we can kind of move forward. I think that's a jumping off point.
As we get started in considering how to have productive conversations, it's helpful to first define some common terms. Let's start with race. Race is a social construct. That is, it is based on social perceptions and stereotypes. Currently, race refers to how a person is characterized on the basis of skin color, culture, or other superficial features. If we were to be more precise, we'd need to talk about ancestry. Racism describes an act, policy, or procedure, whether purposeful or not, that tolerates, accepts, or reinforces racially unequal opportunities or outcomes. Note that under this definition, the focus is on how the actions affect people of color rather than the motivation or intent of the action. Privilege is a term you may have heard of with regard to white people. White people have inherent advantages over people of color. As with racism, privilege refers to unearned social power that includes advantages and rights that exist whether intentional or not. For example, the ability to drive a car without fear of being pulled over by police for no apparent reason is a privilege that white people have that people of color do not. That white people don't realize that this privilege exists is a part of their privilege. In fact, the term white was created by Virginia's slave owners and colonial rules in the 17th century. It replaced terms like Christian and Englishman to distinguish European colonists from Africans and indigenous peoples. The creation of whiteness meant giving privileges to some while denying them to others, with the justification of false biological differences and social inferiority. Whiteness refers to the specific dimensions of racism that serve to elevate white people over people of color. It's more than specific actions and behaviors. It's become part of our social fabric that elevates some over others. These processes and practices include basic rights, values, beliefs, perspectives, and experiences purported to be commonly shared by all, but which are only consistently afforded to white people. It is the component of each and every one of ourselves that expects assimilation to the dominant culture. As Dwight Smith has articulated, creating purposeful dialogue on race helps us to be better equipped in fighting injustices. Systemic change is necessary in creating the equality that marginalized communities deserve, and educated conversations can be the first steps to making that change. The following presents a formal strategy for facilitating group conversations on race. The process can be broken down into a series of steps. As a first step, conversations must begin with a statement of purpose. It's important for all to understand that conversations on race are meant to help us all learn from one another. We begin by reinforcing that our purpose is to explore, listen, and learn from one another. Counselors and educators play crucial roles in helping others talk openly about the historical roots and contemporary manifestations of social inequality and discrimination. Learning how to communicate about race demands courage and skill, regardless of who we are, our intention, or how long we've been practicing or teaching. It is important to use appropriate strategies. These same strategies can also be used to build competency when discussing other types of discrimination, such as gender bias, ableism, and religious or anti-LGBTQIA+ persecution. To help understand this process, a running video example of a PLC will demonstrate each of these steps.
Thank you for coming. Today, we're going to engage in a conversation about race, and I'm going to ask you to be open and honest with yourself and the other members within this group. Now, this conversation could become uncomfortable, but it's working through this discomfort that creates growth, understanding, and learning. So I want everyone to know that our conversations on race are meant to explore, listen, and learn from one another. Now, as we learn about each other's perspectives and experiences concerning race and privilege, you will be asked to reflect and respond to your colleagues as respectfully as possible. This is a process of exploration of ourselves as much as it is to each other. So, anyone have any questions? Okay. So let's move forward with how this conversation should proceed.
Note that the facilitator clearly communicated the purpose of the group and held the group's attention by explicitly describing how to be respectful while having a conversation on race. Once the purpose is understood, the next step is to set the agreements or ground rules to ensure that the conversations are respectful and productive. The purpose is to encourage dialogue, mutual respect, and listening to what others share. It is vital to approach the topic of race with respect. Respect for its weightiness and nuance. Respect for centuries of pain and oppression. Respect for multiple perspectives and narratives. Those that have been lifted up, and those that have been pushed to the background, and those that have not yet been heard. Respect for the persons you are engaging with. Race, racism, and the racial inequity it breeds are topics of discussion that can polarize a space very quickly. Coming from a respectful place that is open and willing to listen and learn goes a long way to diffuse potential discord before it arises and preserve the space for meaningful dialogue.
So the most important facet of today's conversation is to realize that all voices matter and deserve respect. No one can speak to your perspective better than yourself, so engage in your own opinions. Furthermore, everyone's opinion is their own belief and narrative. Therefore, it's very personal. And this personal narrative deserves respect and should be valued as highly as your own opinion in this space. This conversation is about growth. And to that end, there might be some growing pains for some of you. Having a level of respect during and after this conversation will be critical to create meaningful growth and lasting change. As this is a sensitive subject and we need to respect each other's boundaries, I will be calling on you to respond once you have indicated your willingness to do so. So let's start by reading a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, and we can have a discussion about it as a group. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice.
Notice that the facilitator keyed in on the concept of respect as an overarching aspect for their discussions. This is a crucial concept for the facilitation of a meaningful and productive conversation. The facilitator set the stage for the process of exploring, listening, and learning through the lens of respect. After these opening tasks, the next step is to start the conversation. It may be helpful to have the facilitator offer up an introductory topic, something to prompt the initiation of a discussion. This can also serve to help the participants begin to know one another. This will help to drive respectful conversation throughout. These personal stories help to ground the group and provide opportunities for each individual to get comfortable with their own personal narrative. Understanding who you are, your own values and morals, and goals and aspirations will help you to better formulate the next steps in building racial equality.
Okay, so do we have any volunteers to express their opinion on our quote?
Yeah, sure. I'll give it a shot. I mean, I understand what we're going for here, but on a personal level, I mean, I don't really get this whole idea of white privilege. I've worked hard for everything I have, and I kind of feel like I should be respected for it.
Yes, You should be respected, as everyone should be respected. However, have you ever thought about how you were able to achieve so much?
Uh, Hard work.
I have worked hard too, but I think I would have had it differently than you.
Well, how so? I mean, we both have the same degree, and we went to the same school for our graduate degrees. I mean, how was your time harder?
I came from a single family income and I worked full time completing my master's degree. Even if being admitted to the program was difficult. I had a 3.5 undergrad GPA, but I struggled with test taking and I had to take the GRE 3 times before I scored high enough to get in.
It seems to me that affirmative action would have given you advantage, didn't it?
I exceeded all the qualifications otherwise for this master's degree. However, I worked full time because I couldn't get enough financial aid to cover the program. I'm the first person in my family to get an advanced degree. And that's meant a lot to my family and me.
There's a test. Nobody ever talks about it. There is a test that educators must pass to become a teacher in JCPS. Right? What is that? The praxis test. Yes. Right? No one ever talks about that. No. I know so many Black educators that are ready. They've passed all their college courses, that are so ready to step into the classroom, but they've taken it, let me tell you, they've taken it 4, 5, 8, 10 times, right? And this is the only thing that's stopping them. There's so many, and that's not discussed in JCPS. But we don't have the program anymore. I don't think it's funded anymore for the teacher to be supported that first year.
Right. We don't have that.
We don't have that anymore. But the test that costs what, $120 to tell you about the founders of education and there's so many. I'm telling you, there's so many Black educators that's in the waiting room. You know, they're being tutored, and mind you, when I took the practice, I'm like, I don't see any of this in my teaching career, but it's stopping so many Black educators right now. I wish somebody would do a study of that, stopping them right now to become educators in JCPS, the praxis.
Notice how the facilitator opened the floor for discussion and allowed the conversation to deepen through the personal narrative of each of the participants. Then, the facilitator was able to summarize the conversation by showing the similarities and differences of each participant's experience. The conversation became serious and deep very quickly. Personal narratives can have this effect on conversation. Regardless of the comfort level, the facilitator must help people to see the commonalities and differences of our experiences. That way we can get to deeper conversations to talk about concepts such as systemic racism. Personal stories are a good starting point, but conversations must address the larger issue of racial inequality and privilege. In that sense, this is not a surface-level conversation. We must move beyond the personal side of racism and talk more deeply about how to make systemic changes that are equitable for people of color. Part of this deeper conversation involves participants embracing a discomfort of not knowing what we don't know or are unable to relate. It is important to understand that a willingness to be educated and informed is what will help us grow. This is true in life, and especially true when it comes to race. Software engineer Noah Kaplan says, recognize that you don't have all the sides to a story or know everything. Be comfortable with the feeling of not understanding or knowing enough yet. Be comfortable changing your mind. Don't let it hold you back. Let it push you to learn more. It is not enough to recognize and remain complacent in this state of unknowing. Allow this to be a catalyst for an active effort to become informed.
I know, I'm sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. I was just going to see if anybody else had anything to add.
Well, what I was going to say was when I was in high school, I know that my counselor pretty much told me that I wasn't going to I wasn't considered for college because of my grade average. But fortunately, I had a good mentor to encourage me to go to college. And not only did I go to college, I was able to graduate at that point. What I was going to say. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I have a friend who's Black who had a similar experience.
Why do you feel that these types of experiences happen in schools?
Well, I guess some people have issues with people of color.
Does anyone feel as if there may be more than that? Then there is something else driving the bias that they've experienced?
I mean, maybe because of their parents or possibly how they were raised.
I mean, I was going to say maybe even jealousy.
I'm thinking ignorance. Ignorance of how their words affect young people. When I met with my high school counselor, he suggested that I don't go to college.
Wow.
But it wasn't even about my grades.
Who's responsible for teaching the counselor?
You would think whoever taught him.
Yeah.
Who is that?
Well, the parents.
Right.
Yeah, or the
Right.
friends.
Their teachers.
So how do we then change our perspectives if our experiences have taught us to see things differently?
We need to be open. We need to be open to the fact that our narratives give us our own views.
Mm-hmm.
My experiences shape me and my outlook on life. That doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It just means those are my views. It's my experience.
Yeah, like if all we see around us are the depictions from the media of Black people, that they're the ones who are rioting and they're the ones who are shooting the police officers, and that's really the only narrative that we know.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So it's not only recognizing, but understanding that there are multiple perspectives. And we need to know our role in adding to that narrative.
Mhm.
But we also need to
Yeah.
know that there are many perspectives that come together to make a whole.
And respecting those perspectives.
Yeah.
Yep.
At this stage, note that the facilitator helped move the comfortable conversation to a much deeper level. Asking people to think hard about the issues and contemplate their own and others' perspectives.
Some of what I hear comes from the parents. Some of my kids, when they talk, I can tell it's not the kid. Like I can hear the adult through them talking, and sometimes I have to, just because I'm social studies, I have to like give them facts about some of the things that they tell me. I'm like, no, that's not right. Like, where'd you get that from? Okay, well, let me go and show you something different. And so some of the things that are going on in a home and that they're hearing is not necessarily true. And it's like, well, how do I fight and tell that your mom and daddy are wrong? Well, you know what? Tell them to go to this page right here. This is my sourcing, and tell them to look at this for that. But those are conversations sometimes that I find myself having, just breaking down some of the things that they have wrong. You know, just because of what they see in that 30-second TikTok video, or I'm scrolling on Instagram real quick, and that's my reality. Like, that social media is my reality, and it's like, no, it's a little bigger than that, you know. And so I think that's one of the things that I'm seeing is they're a little misinformed on some things that are going on, and some stuff they're spot on.
I feel like as a teacher, I am better equipped working with my students. The fact that I know more about this area, and I know about the issues, and I know as a young person as a young Black person, as a young Black woman, right, who has just grown up in the city, and I have friends and family all over, and I feel even kind of closely connected to my students, because like I said, since I graduated high school like 6 years ago, being 24, I'm not much older than a lot of my students, right, and we lose
She's our future, though.
a lot of that connection, and we have to make sure. So not only are we training implicit bias, and we're talking about, on a broad scale, we're looking directly in our city, because we can see clear segregation in our city. We can see clear white privilege and white supremacy in our systems and our programs, in the policies, in the everyday air that we breathe, right,
Yeah.
in Louisville, Kentucky.
Right.
And we don't, so there's also that context that's really, really important, and even more like now, because we're almost like one of the epicenters in the country for this topic, for these issues. And we have to make sure that all of us are on the same page, and that we understand, and that also as teachers and as educators, that we're not afraid to go into these communities, or afraid to be a part of these communities, or afraid to get our hands dirty in these communities. Because how can I teach students from the West End, but I've never been to the West End? How can I say that I advocate for students in the West End, but I don't go to those buildings, or I go just for photo ops, or I go just to say that I've been there, right? I might go for a sports game if it's in the middle of the day, but probably not, right? So we have to make sure that we're also training within that. There's so much here within our city that we miss out on because we look at the broader scale, but there's so much here. We talk about redlining as if it's some distant like theory, but we have the 9th Street divide here in the city of Louisville, right? We are redlining right here. The reason why we have, excuse me, the segregation that we do within our school system, right, is because of the redlinings, because of the block busting that we ignore. These are not issues, and as progressive as JCPS is, right, and as we're ideally, right, leading the country in our racial equity work in our systems, we have to be willing to address the fact that our city is a part of the problem, and our city is an issue. We're ignoring that, and we're talking about Louisville, and we talk about JCPS as this kind of abstract example, but we're still in the state of Kentucky. We're still just doing these things, and we have to address that.
Next, the facilitator helps the participants reflect on what they discussed.
Now that we have heard from the group, what are the next meaningful steps that we can take as a group?
Well, I think we can all definitely just put ourselves in someone else's shoes to, maybe gain a little bit of perspective.
I think it's more than that. I think it's about respecting the perspective.
Well, I think it's about, you need to realize that everyone's perspective is valuable, and we need to respect those that we haven't respected in the past.
And not respected now.
Yeah, right, because this racial bias goes on all the time, and from your stories, I just can't imagine living that way. I've had hardships, but nothing like that.
So how do we look toward the future and correct these issues?
I mean, we could start by voting for one.
Yes.
I mean, voting for the people who share the respect for all people of color,
And, we can also speak up. What was that quote from Dr. King earlier, that it's not the KKK that pushes people down. It's those who stay silent when they see it happening.
Absolutely. We have to stand with and support those who are victims of this bias, as opposed to saying it's a them problem.
Absolutely.
Right.
So how do these actions make you feel? What do you feel like will be the consequences of these actions?
Oh, well, I personally don't exactly know when I can express these feelings. And I'm not really sure right now that I'm ready to.
But if people would be willing to do that, then we can have conversations with people with authority and create meaningful change.
And that's what we're trying to do here. That's what we're trying to do here. Create ways to bring about learning and meaningful change.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You got a good heart.
In the final stage, the facilitator helps to guide the conversation to a close. It is helpful in closing to summarize what was said and to propose continuation. These recommendations require you to understand yourself, others, and the situations at hand. This process brings about empathy, which is a crucial ingredient of meaningful action. The hope is that we all become better equipped to talk about racism and to come together to make a positive difference in our communities. If you share in that hope, taking action in your own life on any of these points is a great start. Perhaps the best way to think of the value of this process is to consider this quote by Oliver Wendell Holmes. A mind that is stretched by new experience can never go back to its old dimensions.
Wow, this was some really great work today on such a difficult topic. I saw lots of progress from this group. Unfortunately, the work doesn't end here as far as from seeing the equity in our society that we are hoping for, that we deserve. But before I let you go, I'd like for you to reflect on your own story and where your privileges and bias lie, and try to work on one of those aspects of your life. If you're willing, I would really appreciate having you back sometime soon to hear about what personal progress you're making and perhaps how that progress has started to make a change in society. I want to thank you all again and see you soon.
It's important to note that the closing of this particular conversation was not seen as its end. Rather, the facilitator brought the session to a close with an open invitation to continue the conversation in the near future. The more these productive dialogues occur, the more likely that individuals will internalize what they learn by listening to another with mutual respect.
You know, we had this, the Kentucky State, I don't know if you all had to do it, or we had to do it, the implicit bias training.
Yes.
Was cool.
Yeah, we all
And I thought that was good. Like,
Yeah.
I talked to several of my colleagues, and a few of them were like, wow, you know, like, I wonder if I did that. You know, it opened some eyes. And I was like, well, that's a great start. How are we going to keep that going throughout the year? There has to be deliberate, intentional efforts to make sure our teachers are reflecting on this. And it can't just be something where we do the one training in the summer and then we, you know, check a box off, or have you used the ARE for this? You know, and it's like, all right, what are we doing deliberately, like continuously, to make sure our teachers are aware of the potential impact they're having on these kids?
I feel like I started implicit bias training. Well, I did start implicit bias training like in 2005 in my undergrad. And so I feel like I'm fairly woke, but it's really easy as a white person to get complacent.
Yeah.
And unless we're constantly checking those microaggressions, I can get really, there's racism ingrained in the way that I was raised. And so we have to be vigilant about constantly checking those, or they resurface.
That's right. That's right.
So I agree, it has to be continuous. So I'm glad that there are things that are being implemented.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that the district had us do that training.
While every conversation on race may not end with all participants in agreement, the goal is to educate, provide tools for facilitation, and to create an opportunity for people to express views in a safe and respectful environment.